All right, welcome back. Well, this week, Aaron preached on Revelation 22 and concluded the sermon series True Story with his sermon titled The End. Before we get into the questions, we wanted to give Aaron a moment to talk about justification for the eternal nature of hell. You know, Sunday you'd mentioned really briefly and then kind of threw it out there as a plug for the podcast that there was some work that you did on finding justification for the eternal nature of hell, but weren't able to really put it into the sermon, which I think is fine and fitting. But we want to give you an opportunity to talk about that here. So what are your thoughts on that? What does Scripture have to say about that?
Absolutely. Briefly, there are some who say, who make the argument, basically, why will I be sent to hell, or why would anybody be sent to hell for eternity? Doesn't that seem like a harsh punishment?
Right.
So basically, if we live 75, 85 years here on earth in sin, why wouldn't God just allow someone to live 75, 85 years in hell and either annihilate them or even transfer them to heaven? You know, what's the deal with that? I think some good thoughts were put forth by R.C. Sproul a few years back. He was presented with a question about why the punishment on Adam and Eve, being kicked out of the garden, the curses being put on them.
Right.
Why was it so harsh?
What's wrong with you people?
Yes, that's exactly.
It's a famous line from that. It was a little Roundtable thing.
Go look it up. Go watch it. It's
Google
awesome.
R.C. Sproul. What's wrong with you people?
Right.
Yep.
What's wrong with you people? But anyway, he answered that question and the reason he said, what's wrong with you people, is because we greatly underestimate the holiness of God.
Right.
The set apartness of God. Isaiah chapter 6 is R.C. Sproul actually also did a series on the holiness of God, and that's how he breaks down Isaiah 6 in that. And it's just a wonderful passage of Scripture that talks about the seraphim flying around the throne of God. Yeah. And basically, God is infinitely holy, and when we sin against an infinitely holy God, we deserve an infinite punishment.
Sure.
Right? So I liken that to a little analogy that I came up with. If I invited you over to my house, you came into my house and you went to my refrigerator where my 3-year-old son has drawn a masterful piece of artwork there.
Right.
And you took it off my fridge and folded it up, put it in your pocket, and walked out my door. Chances are I would not call the police on you.
Right.
Chances are I probably wouldn't even say anything to you about it. I would just let you take the picture, right? However, if I bought a ticket to Paris, France, and went to the Louvre, and if I was able, took the Mona Lisa off the wall and folded it up, put it in my pocket, and tried to walk out, I wouldn't even get to the door before I would be tased, handcuffed, fined hundreds of thousands of dollars and mandatory jail time, right?
Right.
Why? Because the Mona Lisa is much more valuable than the picture of a dog that looks like spaghetti and meatballs that my 3-year-old son died, right? And the same's true with us, right? And the same's true about sinning with God, because the crime is so much infinitely far worse. So the punishment must fit the crime.
Right. Well, I think, too, and one of the things that just thinking about that is that we, even in that analogy, is we're sinning against another person who's on the same level as us. And God is on a completely different level.
Right.
So even our laws, if you kill somebody, in some states, you can be killed for that as part of penal judgment, But you're still only committing an act of transgression against a person. You're not committing an act of transgression against God.
Right.
So we have to keep that in mind as well. I think when we come to thinking about sin or even talking about sin, is that sin is not just, and I don't remember where I read this week, but sin is not just transgression, period. It's not just wrongdoing, period. It's wrongdoing in particular against God.
Yeah.
Like me stealing from someone is wrong, but it's a sin because it's against God. Because I'm, so. Yeah, no, that's good. Do you have any other justification you want to bring up or anything else you want to talk about with that?
I just wanted to briefly mention that before we take up too much of our time.
Yeah, so think about the believer. Why is that so important for a believer to be reminded of that, of whether it's the eternal nature of hell, but something else that you said, just talking about our sin against an infinitely holy God, reminds us that we deserve infinite punishment.
Right.
So what joy is there for the believer in that? Why should we remind ourselves of that?
Yeah, so a couple things. First, before we get to the joy of believer, I think it in the believer's mind, in the believer's heart, it should bring to our hearts the seriousness of our sin.
Right.
Yeah.
Even as believers, because even if we're believers, we're still sinning against an infinite holy God.
Right.
But the joy comes in where God pours out His justice and His wrath upon His Son on our behalf, so that we don't have to face that that punishment any longer, because He's put it on His Son.
Yeah, and it shows us the depths of the love of Christ.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Is that He forgives us of that transgression of sinning against an infinitely holy God.
Right.
That He covers Adam and Eve.
Mercy.
The mercy of God is so deep and wide and beautiful. Yeah. So until we, I think, realize the depths of our sin, we realize the depths of His grace.
Yep.
And that should overwhelm us with joy.
I think it can also have an evangelical implication there. And I think this is one of the things you were driving home on Sunday that was really helpful for me, was just the impact, understanding, and having a proper understanding of the end has on our evangelism, has on our urgency that we live in towards evangelism, towards sharing the gospel with unbelievers. If you believe in something like annihilationism, where at the end of things God just annihilates completely, Thanos snaps them out of existence, and then that's it, then there isn't much urgency. Unless you really want for everyone to experience God forever, there isn't much urgency, because there's no hell.
Right.
So you knowing someone who's lost, well, they're not going to suffer, because they're just going to be annihilated. Mm-hmm. They're just going to disappear. But if you believe that there is a place called hell and it's an eternal suffering, then I think that it helps maybe provide a little bit more urgency for you towards sharing the gospel with people.
Sure. Absolutely. That's something.
Not just because of the place, but because you don't want people to experience life completely apart from God.
Sure. Yeah. And it's something that we brought out to in small group in our youth Sunday night. We actually had that conversation as we talked about the sermon, kind of rehashed some stuff. And it's not going to work like this. Like, I don't think it is anyway. I mean, but I said, just imagine some of the people that you encounter and that you have these deep relationships with that are going to be going through their judgment, right, and look over at you and be like, oh, you never shared the gospel with me. Like, you never told me the hope that right. I had. Now, ultimately, they're responsible for their own decisions, and they're responsible for their own rebellion against God.
Right.
However, and it's probably not going to work like that. We all stand before God individually by ourselves, However, what a reality that brings before our eyes, So,
right. No, absolutely, and just to echo that point, we all stand before God because of our own personal sin. So my unwillingness to share the gospel with someone doesn't send them to hell.
Right.
They're already there. They're already heading there.
Yeah.
But you're being, to me, I like to put it as you're basically being, that's kind of a form of sin, because you are being disobedient to God where God says go and tell.
Right.
All right, well, getting into some of our questions this week. First one we got, it says, in the sermon, you said that Christians will and should rejoice about the second coming of Christ. Being a believer also means that we know how sinful we are. Is it normal to be nervous about the judgment or second coming, knowing that we have faith in Jesus, but also knowing that we do not deserve to be in God's presence because of our sinful nature? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So being a Christian does, let's just take that part of that question. He says being a believer also means that we know how sinful we really are. Right. That's part of the truth, but part of being a believer is knowing how sufficient God's work is through Christ on the cross, right? Knowing that sufficiency, it still can be a terrifying thing, because God's judgment and God's justice and His wrath is a great and terrible thing, isn't it? And so I heard Don Carson give a great analogy, a great story about this. We've got time to share
Yeah, go
it.
ahead.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's just a couple minutes. So Don Carson shares this.
Only if
this-
it drives to the point.
Yes, it does. So Don Carson shares this story. He says, "Okay, just imagine at the first Passover. You remember the death angel he's about to come over,
Right.
And the people are given the command to do what? To put the blood over the doorposts." And he says, "So imagine two Israelites, and both of them are out there. They meet each other out there. They're putting the blood on the doorpost. They're preparing the Passover supper. They're both going to eat it, but one is really nervous. Like, what's going to happen? Like, I know that the firstborn's going to be killed. I know that that great judgment's going to come throughout the land. So I know great and terrible things are going to happen tonight. But the other one's like, oh no, we got this. No sweat. Like this is going to be a cakewalk for us. You know, I trust God. Trust God.
Right.
So the night comes and the death angel comes over and he says, Don Carson says, which one's firstborn died? And he says, well, of course, neither.
Right.
Why? Because the blood of the lamb was put on the doorpost.
Right.
So it speaks more, even though we know that we're sinful, and even though that we know that we are rebellious and sinful against God, the intensity of our faith does not save us.
Right.
It is the blood of the Lamb that saves us, right?
Right.
And so Revelation chapter 12, verses 10 and 11, the accuser is accusing the brethren and accusing the believers day and night. And what do they combat that accuser with? Well, it's not the intensity of their faith.
Right.
It's
the object of their faith.
It's their object of their faith. It's the blood of the Lamb,
Right.
right? And so, yeah.
Yeah, one passage that came to mind, just kind of as you brought that up, was the end of the Old Testament in Malachi that says, "Behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all arrogant and evildoers will be stubble. The day that is coming shall set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch." And so he goes on to say, this is the great and the awesome day of the Lord.
Right.
It says, "But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings. You shall go leaping like calves from the stall, and you shall tread down the wicked, for they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I act, says the Lord of hosts." Now, there's some other things we could say about that, about the first coming and second coming and whatnot. But I think the point is, for those who fear the name, whose faith is in the blood of the Lamb, this is a day of healing. This
Right.
is a day of restoration. This is a day of joy that is coming, where the Son of Righteousness shall come with healing in his wings.
Right.
And so yeah, I still remember sitting right over there in the sanctuary as a little kid during revivals, and they would sing the song. I still remember this clear as day. "Soon and very soon we are going to see the King."
Right.
That song used to terrify me.
Yeah.
I wasn't ready for Christ to come back. And I don't know if that was the Spirit convicting me of not being saved at that moment,
Sure.
or just the idea and the thought
Yeah.
of Christ coming back, and what does that look like?
Right.
So for the believer, those who trust in the name and fear the name, this will be a day of healing, and the sun will rise with healing in his wings. And so,
Right. Yeah, and I think perhaps our if we do respond in fear, anxiety, nervousness, whatever it is, I think that there might be times when we're reading passages like this, or you read the book of Revelation, and there are some fearful or I don't want to say scary, but some weird things that come up there that might be like, oh, that's kind of crazy. But if our response is solely fear, I think that might be an area of critique for us to be able to look at and say, well, why?
Yeah.
Why am I fearful of this? Just like what you're talking about with your response to the soon and very soon, is that why am I reacting this way? Because there is a weightiness to it that should lead us to then respond joyfully in the covering of Christ, the covering of the blood, because we could say, well, I'm not going to face that in the same way an unbeliever will.
Right.
So I think that there can definitely be a side of it that says, well, that might be an area for us to look at and say, is that evidence of unbelief, or is this just that I need to continue to work through this?
a healthy fear.
Right. Yeah, because I definitely think, John Piper talks about this a lot, that there is there's obviously Scripture talks about reverence, having fear of the Lord and things like that. And so I think there is a healthy fear of God that exists because he is God.
Right.
He doesn't stop being God because he becomes our Father. He is still God.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's good. The next question we got, Revelation 21:8 mentions sorcerers in the same line as other sinful acts. So is sorcerers specific to that time only, or could it also have reference to today?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it can definitely have reference to today. And let me just say, I don't think that stopped.
Right.
We live here in South Louisiana where voodoo is still prominent.
Yep.
And
Go to the quarter, you get your palms read.
Yeah, that's right. And
Don't go to the quarter.
Yeah, don't go to the quarter.
Don't get your palms read.
Right.
That was a joke.
So
You can go to the quarter, right? You just said don't go to the quarter. Just
Don't go to the
just
quarter to get your palms read.
Okay.
to get your palms read. Yeah,
Others are like
we need to
boycotting the quarter, though.
clarify.
Just
We need
making
to
sure.
clarify. Okay. All right. So the Greek word for this is actually pharmakos, and this is where we get our English word pharmacist
Pharmacist,
from. Right. My dad was a pharmacist. Doesn't mean he was a sorcerer. But these are people that a lot of times back in that day, drugs, that
Right.
would give you a high. This is how they had a lot of their spiritual visions. This is how they spoke to demonic spirits. Now, whether demonic activity was happening then and there, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And I believe that is a source for demonic activity
Right.
is linked. And we certainly see that today.
Well, and we see that even back in the Old Testament, that God has never allowed sorcery. I mean, back in the Old Testament, one of the things that happened under Saul's rule, and then he winds up going to the witch of Endor,
Yep.
not the Star Wars place.
The Witch of Endor.
But he winds up going to her because he's kicked all the other witches witches and sorcerers out of Israel, and so he has to leave Israel in order to go to this witch to try to summon Samuel, and Samuel. We're not going to talk about that passage, what that means, but anyway, so we see even back in the Old Testament that there is a restriction on witchcraft, sorcery,
Seance.
yeah, things of the occult.
Do you think it still creeps in today with things like vibes and positive energy?
Yeah, people talk about karma.
Right.
Yeah. But in particular, what you're talking about, I think New Age spirituality can definitely play a piece into it. And there was a kind of a renaissance in spiritualism in the 1920s. Was it 1860s? Right after the Civil War, all these people lost their family, and this is in America that I'm talking about in particular. All these people lost their family members in war, and so there's this big revival in spiritualism, and that's where we see the kind of the modern take on seances came out of parlor seances, where people would come and try to get in touch with their brother or sister that died in war, their father that died in war, and they would have these seances that would happen. And some of that was parlor tricks, some of it was legitimate dealing with witchcraft. So I think, we definitely see that still today. I'll be honest, living in Africa for a little while, you go outside of the Western world, and not to say that it doesn't exist within the Western world, because it does, but it's a lot more prevalent in places that are not industrialized. Being in Africa, when I was there, at least, we had a couple of encounters with people who were witch doctors. That's what they called them, or people that were basically demon possessed, or people that were trying to keep a hold on a village through demonic activity. And so, I think you definitely still see that today. So I don't know that it's. I would not say that it is specific to that time. I think it can still definitely reference today, and it could be something as big as that, or something as small as what you're talking about, which I still don't think is small. But bringing in good vibes, or trying to create a folk religion out of Christianity and karma, or Christianity and vibes and feelings.
New Age infiltration. Right.
Because there is, Oprah, for instance, one of the things that got big because of her is this book called The Secret. Mm-hmm. And there, some of our listeners might have even read it or heard about it. As basically what it's talking about is this: it's a New Age spiritualism, and it's this kind of name it, claim it, speaking into the universe, only positive vibes. I'm not going to deal with negativity, because if I think something negative, then that negative thing will happen. But if I think only positive thoughts and those positive, so I'm just going to think about money, and eventually money will come into my life. I'm going to think about success, and success will come into my life. So you can definitely still bring some of that in, even as a Christian, and say, I'm just going to think about being sinless. I'm going to think about killing that sin in my life that I'm dealing with, and Christ will reward me. Or I'm going to think about, wealth or whatever, and Christ will reward me. So you could definitely still bring it in. And this passage mentions that, where it says that it's in the same line as other sinful acts.
Yep.
So
you're correct.
We have a response that we should be giving to it. Any other thoughts on that? No? No. All right. Next question. So why is Christ the reward? You made this statement where you said it's not heaven that's the reward when you're preaching. It's not heaven that's the reward, though it is a reward, but Christ is the reward. So what do you mean by that? Why is Christ the reward versus heaven being the reward? Is there a dichotomy there?
One way I've heard it said before we turn you loose is heaven because God is there.
Right.
And so that's one simple way that,
Sure.
that's what makes heaven is the presence of God.
To state the negative, I think I mentioned on Sunday. I think it was Randy Alcorn who said, "Heaven without Christ is hell."
Yeah.
Right.
And so when we talk about heaven, I think our mind kind of fogs out to just the reward part, or just some kind of advanced state or whatever that we're in. But when we're talking about heaven, I mean, we're talking about a place.
Right.
We're talking about you're talking about a city, the heaven.
Right.
You're talking about the new earth. This is what you're talking about. And when we talk about even earth today and cities today, or just natural creation today, what is the point of creation? Mm-hmm. Well, it's to point to the glory of God, isn't
right.
it? Romans is replete with that kind of language. Psalms is replete with all that kind of language, that the heavens declare the glory of God, right? And so it won't be different in the new heavens and new earth. Still, the beauty, the splendor, the wonders of the new heaven and new earth will still serve that purpose to point to the glory of God. Right?
In a better way.
Yeah, and in a better way, in a more perfect way, in a more complete way, without the curse, right? And so, this is what we mean. Still, the focal point is not the creation itself, but the focal point is the Creator,
right?
And to be with the Creator and to experience the presence of the Creator, unadulterated by sin, is the true reward. I mean, let me give an example real quick. Go to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, which me and my wife have been to several times, and we've been to Dollywood over there.
Right.
This is a fun little theme park. Dollywood's got this cool little sign that you take a picture in front of, right? It would be foolish to buy a ticket to Dollywood, as expensive as it is, and go just hang out by the sign all day.
Right.
We want to go in. We want to experience Dollywood, right? We want to experience the theme park itself. Going to heaven for heaven's sake without Christ is like going to Dollywood and sitting by the sign.
Sure.
What heaven and the new earth points to is the glory of Christ. You can experience that directly, right?
Right. No, that's good. I think I was reading something by John Piper this past week, or it may have been in one of his Ask Pastor John's, which if y'all listen to that podcast, you might have already heard this, but he talked about how if your grandma's there and your mom's there and you've got everything that you could ever want in heaven, but God's not there, and this is what you're talking about, then it's not heaven. Like there's no, you've got all these good things, but it's not the greatest thing.
Right.
And ultimately, like for me, one of the things that kind of led to my salvation when I was 18 was, as I thought about, when I was growing up, man, people always talked about heaven, we're going to be singing praises to God all the time. And as a kid, that just wasn't appealing to me. I was like, because my church still wore choir robes. And so I was like, I'm not going to be in choir robes singing that just does not sound like a good time. Robes? Not at the time. I mean, now I'm like, I miss a choir. But, thinking about that as I was a kid, it was like, man, that just doesn't sound like a good time singing in choir robes or whatever. But the reality is, when we get to heaven, no matter what we're doing, whether it be, whatever your view is on heaven as far as if we're going to work or we're not going to work, if it's, it's going to be with Christ. And so those tertiary or secondary things really don't matter, because you're now in the presence of God. Mm-hmm. You're now in the presence of Christ. In a way that you're not here. So what you're doing wouldn't matter as much. And so, this last question kind of feeds off the question, or some of the answer you were bringing up a little bit there when you're talking about the old creation, new creation. Why does God wait to defeat Satan and create the new heaven and new earth? Like why didn't he, when Jesus, all those disciples. So Jesus dies, he is resurrected, he ascends, and all the disciples are sitting there waiting. Why didn't he just usher in the new heaven right then?
All right. This is like a long way, because I think no matter how you answer this question biblically, you're always going to come back to the short answer, which is within the question. I know answers God's timing.
Right.
You're always going to get back to the answer.
Right.
Right. We can try to explain it all day long, but I think short answer would just be because of. There are certain attributes of God, and there are certain characteristics of God that are glorified and most brought out by the presence of Satan. Now, I'm not saying that Satan works to that end, and I'm not trying to come up with heresy here by any means. But the presence of evil God. Why does God allow evil? You get to the problem of evil. Why does God allow sickness and suffering? And why does God allow these things? Part of the reason is because of sin, our sin, that brings that about. But God uses that sin, that evil, to show His glory within that. For example, like how would we know God's patience except if God has the opportunity to show His patience toward us, in that we are sinners and He is patient toward us and bring us to salvation, if I'm even making sense.
Sure. Well, I mean, yeah, just to use a biblical example of what you're talking about, God used Satan as a means of tearing Job down in the book of Job in order to show His greatness. And yeah, we see a part of Job where God rebukes Job. God's, where were you?
Right.
Where, stand before me, gird yourself and stand up like a man. And then He takes him to task on it. But God used Satan as a tool. It isn't that He responds. God's not reactionary.
Right. And so the question is, so why doesn't God take Satan out right now? And then I think that's just why. It's God's timing. Right. God's got His perfect timing, perfect pleasures. I'm thinking, okay, if God would have taken Satan out, now this is, maybe taking it too far, you can rein me back in. But if God would have taken Satan out at that moment of the resurrection and would have ended all things right there, well, I mean, doesn't leave me a shot because I'm not in existence yet.
Right.
So he prolongs that time for His good purposes. And really part of that reason is to bring people in that is part of His fold.
Right. You bring the fullness of His flock in the fold, and somehow God is going to be most glorified by His timing.
Right.
And so we can take great comfort in that. I'm not sure exactly why, as far as particular reasons, but we know, I guess, the reason is somehow in God's great wisdom, this will bring most glory to Himself.
Yeah. No, I think. We could reread Revelations and we see that there seems to be, and I'm not saying we should go through and try to figure out the days and the hours based on the book of Revelation, but there seems to be a structure in the way that God has dealt with sin in Christ's defeat of sin, and now is going to deal with Satan over the course of time, depending on what your position is on the millennium, and we're not going to go into that now. So if you were looking forward to a discussion on the millennium, this is not the podcast for you, but we can definitely send you some really good resources from people that know a lot more about it than we do. But yeah, so I think that there's an aspect of it where, because some people might say too, like, well, why did God wait to bring Jesus, at 32 or turn of the millennium? I don't know. Is that whatever it would be, going from BC to AD?
Yeah.
Why did God bring Him then? Well, it's because of His perfect timing.
Right, when the fullness of time had come.
Right. So there was something that God needed to accomplish by that point. God needed to, I don't know if accomplish is the right word there, but something must happen, or something must have happened prior to Christ that then led to Christ. And granted, everyone could always throw the question back, well, why didn't He just shorten that? Or why did He have to make it that way? Or ask God.
But I think we have to just, and that's why I say it's always going to come back to
Right.
that one answer.
Right.
It's in His timing. He has accomplished His good purposes in His timing. The way that He has ordained that it would happen. Who are we as creatures to say to the Creator,
Right, exactly.
why have you created me or created this, thus and so,
Right.
One passage, I don't know if that's the last question, but here's one of my final thoughts. One passage I'll often go to is Matthew 24, where Jesus says, no one knows the day and the hour of His return. There's two therefore statements in there. And so anytime we're talking about the end times or whatever else, I like to go to Matthew 24 and say, look what Jesus said. He says, therefore, stay awake and therefore be ready. So how do we respond to all this? Are you ready?
Right.
Are you ready for His return? Have you trusted in Him? Are you taking refuge in the blood of the Lamb? And are you awake? Are you going to be found doing the Lord's will? Because we'll be given account for our actions.
Right.
And so are you awake? Is He going to find you, doing the Master's work, glorifying Him with your work? So what do we do in light of all this? Stay awake, be watching and waiting, because no one knows the day or the hour.
Right.
So stay awake and be ready.
Yeah.
Because we don't know. So make sure you're ready today.
Yeah, and we have the two parables Jesus gives where He talks about the women, the virgins waiting on the bridegroom to come, and so some of them didn't bring enough oil, and when the bridegroom came, they went back into town to buy oil. So hitting on your point, like, what are you doing? Are you sleeping, or are you working? Are you waiting on the Messiah to return a second time? And it might happen before we die, or it might happen way after we die.
Yep.
But either way, I think it brings in that sense of waiting. You think about Simeon and Anna in the New Testament, in the beginning of Matthew, I believe, when they were waiting on, and they were promised the son, that they would see Jesus.
Yeah.
And they waited and waited and waited and waited, and then He came, and their response was joy. So, Well, if you have any questions you'd like to hear our thoughts on, email your questions to questions@riversidelife.org. And if you may have any questions that maybe not pertain necessarily to the sermon this past week, but you'd like to hear them discussed anyways, we're going to start doing a second podcast called Off Topic, where we discuss themes or topics from the Bible that are your questions. So you can also email those questions to questions@riversidelife.org. Those podcasts won't come out as often, but there'll be a little bit more work that hopefully we get to do on those, researching them. And we hope that these podcasts help you to grow in your walk with God, striving side by side for the gospel of Jesus Christ.
There's a lot of names dropped in that episode.
Like who?
We got DA, we got RC, we got
John Pipe.
Johnny P, we got Randy Alcorn. We should call this the name dropping episode.
We'll call this.
I almost asked.
Someone's a lot smarter than I am podcast.
I almost asked who's Thanos, but
Okay.
I was about to crush the mood because it was a serious moment at that point about evangelizing. So I didn't want to
Well, when he made the Star Wars reference,
I didn't want to be silly at that point.
I was like, Jarrod wouldn't get that.
Well, it was the Witch of Endor, right?
Yeah, it was the
Witch of Endor.
Yeah.
And then they had a.
But Endor is the planet that
Endor was the
Luke
farthest,
Skywalker goes to.
The moon, furthest moon.
The farthest
from
moon
Endor.
of Endor. Yeah.
Yeah, but he doesn't get that still.
No.
Endor
Zero chance.
was
I mean, I've seen some Star Wars, but
Endor was the planet that
and I'm okay with that.
the planet that had a moon where Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker fought in Episode 6.
That was
Number 3.
That
of
was
the
where the Ewoks.
original trilogy.
Oh, I love the Ewoks.
Yep.
Is that where the Ewoks are?
Yeah,
Okay,
the
then I
Ewoks.
love Endor. Yeah, Ewoks
Moon
were
of Endor.
they were my jam.
Really?
Yeah,
I thought that was the most ridiculous part of Star Wars.
that was the best part.
Really?
I didn't like the Ewoks.
Loved the Ewoks.
I didn't like the Ewoks when they were beating up the stormtroopers. I'm like, really, come on.
The Ewoks, man.